My flight was scheduled for 10:30 p.m. Scheduled, I say, because of course it was delayed. Usually this would have irritated me, as most of the time when I'm flying, I'm on a strict schedule and I have a car waiting for me at my destination. Not this time. This was a flight home and my car was in the paid parking. A few hours wouldn't matter. No, I was paying by the day. 3 days already, in fact. See, 3 days ago I flew out to Chicago to pay my respects to an uncle that had passed. Car accident. Some family picked me up from the airport, so if my flights had been delayed on the way there, it would have been an issue, but on the way back, I had time to kill. I didn't have to be to work for another 2 days, and I used to love flying. Not anymore. Not after what I've seen. My flight being delayed changed everything. What was supposed to be a 1 hour flight departing at 10:30 p.m. turned into an actual nightmare. I don't know if I'll ever fly again. I was waiting in the terminal with everyone else when at about 10:15 p.m. the gate attendant made an announcement. Attention, Flight 382 to Atlanta due to technical difficulties. This flight has been delayed until 12 o'clock a.m. We're sorry for any inconvenience this may cause you. Again, Flight 382 to Atlanta has been delayed until midnight tonight. Thank you. Before the sounds of the groans and protests of the other passengers could catch up with her, the attendant hung up the phone announcement and began apologizing to the passengers that had immediately made their way to the gate, as if their pleas and harsh words could somehow fix whatever technical difficulties had arisen. There were probably 30 people altogether on this flight. About 10 of them had already formed an impatient line. I laughed to myself at them. The ones complaining were probably the same ones that stood up inside the plane right after touchdown, like they wouldn't have to wait for the entire front of the plane to empty out like the rest of us. I stretched and pulled my book out of my backpack. As a frequent flyer, I knew how to travel and had only brought this backpack with me. I wore a thin cotton beanie that doubled as an eye mask, a hoodie that went over my loose shirt, and comfortable semi-stretchy jeans that were one step above sweatpants. I pulled my headphones from my pants pocket and set them in my ears, playing a soft background noise as I started to read. I couldn't help but notice a good bit of movement around me, as the other passengers began to wander off, probably to use the restrooms or get something to eat from whatever shops were still open at this time of night. I had eaten already on the way to this terminal. With all this movement, it was hard to focus on my book, so I set it back in my bag, pulled my phone out, and set the alarm for 1 hour. I may as well get some sleep while I wait. It would at least make the time go by faster. I set the volume of my soft music just enough to drown out the noises around me, but not so loud that I would miss my announcements. I pulled the beanie down over my eyes and leaned back as far as I comfortably could in my chair. I was asleep in seconds. Then I woke up. I lifted my beanie from my eyes and checked the time on my phone. It was 11:25. I smiled, a bit thankful that I had beaten my alarm and wouldn't miss. I looked around at the empty terminal. There were no gate attendants, no other passengers, and no signs that anyone had even been here. The TVs that I could see were playing static, and the large screens on the wall that unusually displayed a marquee flight information were just black. Cursing under my breath, I pocketed my headphones and threw my bag over my shoulders. They must have moved terminals. I don't know how I didn't hear the announcement. My music wasn't loud, and I was not that tired. Hell, it felt like I did a little more than blink, let alone sleep, for almost an hour. And why didn't anyone wake me? It's not their responsibility, I know, but you'd think that they would have seen me, the last one on the terminal, sleeping before they shut off the flight info screens and switched television to static. All of this, I thought to myself as I speed walked to the information screens, looking around me again. I couldn't see or hear anyone or anything. I ran my fingers along the sides of the monitor, looking for a button to press and either turn on the screens on or take them off. Sleep mode. Anything to find out where I need to go. Finally, I found a button and impatiently pressed it. The screen crackled a little and slowly faded it from black to show a grid of flight information. Normally, these would be filled with scrolling text and numerous different flights, but this one only had one flight on it. Flight 283, Atlanta to Atlanta, 12 a.m. Terminal, E12 on time. I looked up at the sign above me. It was in Terminal C, which meant I had to take the train to E. Luckily, the train wasn't far. I had taken it already to get from the main food concourse to Terminal C. Something felt odd about the text. Why was it that only one flight was displayed? Something else was nagging at me, but I couldn't put my finger on it right away. And I didn't have time to wait to figure it out. I checked my phone again. It was now 11:32. My phone would be boarding soon. I sprinted away from my original terminal down the hall to the escalators that were descending. I skipped steps and hurried down, unwilling to ride the slow-moving stairs. It was amazing how fast I reached the lower train when I didn't have to wait for anyone or push through crowds. It was all so empty, so quiet. I only had to wait a minute for the train to arrive. The doors opened, and I stepped inside. It was too it too was early apparently. They didn't schedule many flights at 4 midnight or something because in all of my years of traveling, I had never gone so long in an international airport without seeing someone. The intercom buzzed at me. The next stop is Terminal E. This is the final stop. I leaned against the support pole and checked my phone again nervously. It was 11:36. The train jerked ahead, sped through its tunnel. A soft ding told me it would soon be stopping, and I stopped leaning against the pole and held onto it instead. The train slowed, causing me to lean to the side. I waited impatiently for the door to open. "Welcome to Terminal E," said the voice. I stood in front of the door, waiting and waiting. What the hell was going on? Why didn't they open? I checked up and down the train car, searching for something. Maybe a switch or a lever I needed to activate. Nothing. I couldn't wait anymore. I squeezed my fingers into the door jamb and pulled them apart. They hesitated at first, then slid open. I stepped through and raced up the escalators to the new terminal. It too was empty. The TVs all showed the same static. Shops were closed and hallway lights were off. This creeped me out now. A new terminal, the terminal that held my flight, shouldn't be empty. Something was wrong. I couldn't see where to go because, again, all the monitors were off. So I speed walked to the center of the terminal and looked up at the directory signs. Terminal 16 was to my left, and 712 was ahead of time. I checked my phone again. 11:50. Where had all the time gone? I picked up my pace and ran down the hallway, reading the terminal numbers as I went. They were all empty. No screens, no gate attendees, and no passengers. I looked ahead towards the end, where my gate would be. And finally, for the first time since I had fallen asleep, I could see someone else. I sprinted out the rest of the hall and stopped at E12. The gate attendant was standing in the middle of the dimly lit hallway, arms behind her back. She smiled at me. Her smile was wide, and the dim light made her eyes look a bit shadowed. Or maybe she was just tired. Who knew how long she had already worked and attended this midnight flight? "We were wondering if you would make it," she said calmly, without not breaking that wide smile. Out of breath, I breathed out, "Yeah, I fell asleep and missed the call or something." "Well, you're here now. Would you like to begin boarding flight 283? She said, ushering towards the gate. I nodded and caught my breath. "Absolutely. Geez, I thought I was going to miss it." She moved to her side of the podium at the gate and held out her hand. "Ticket?" she said. I reached in my pocket and pulled out many times folded ticket the many times folded ticket as I passed it to her. I realized what had bothered me earlier. The flight number was different than my ticket. It was reversed. My ticket read Flight 382. I put it out of my hand. Maybe they had just changed the numbers since the first flight had been delayed. She took the ticket and set it face down on the scanner. It beeped, once letting us know it had been registered. She then handed back my ticket and held out her hand, gesturing towards the jet bridge. "Thanks," I said, pocketing the ticket. She didn't reply, only smiled at me. I don't think that smile broke once. I hurried down the hallway. The walls were a gray carpet-like material. The lights overhead was circular and flickered slightly. As I bounced in my hurried walk, the hall seemed to go on for an unusual amount of time. It was curved, so I couldn't really see too far ahead. The lights seemed to flicker more now, out of sync with my steps. I feel my nervousness starting to return. How long could a jet bridge be? My speed walk picked up. More hallway. Damn. I damn near started to run. As I did, the hallway finally ended. I was looking at the door to the plane, with a flight attendant standing just inside. She too wore the same wide smile. "Hello, please sit anywhere you like, and we will be taking off soon," she said. Anywhere I'd like. Anywhere the other 30 or so passengers weren't sitting, I thought to myself. I stepped inside the plane and froze. Every seat was empty. And this wasn't some puddle jumper 15-seater. No, this was a full-on 747. I wanted to take a seat. I wanted to just put my headphones in and drown out all the weirdness. But this just felt wrong. I turned to the flight attendant. She was closing the hatch. "Wait, where are the other passengers?" I asked her. "You are the only passenger tonight." She pulled the lever in and twisted the lock. Then turned to me with that wide smile. "And this plane is going to Atlanta, right?" At the last terminal, there was a whole crowd of people, I told her. My voice felt shaky as I felt inside, like I was in the wrong place on the wrong time. "Yes, our dimension is Atlanta. Flight time approximately 2 hours. Please have a seat anywhere you'd like, and we'll begin takeoff shortly," she instructed. I smiled back at her and took a seat in the middle of the plane, just in front of the wing. It felt rude to take a seat at the back, and part of me didn't want to sit close to the front where she could, if she would even, talk to me. Unusually, I would have already put my headphones in and zoned out, but I still felt weird. I looked through the aisle at the flight attendant as she picked up a phone. that was mounted on the wall. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I was sure it was her telling the captain that the plane was boarded. All the passengers, me, were now seated. As if in response to my thoughts, the overhead radio crackled to life. I expected the typical introduction of, this is your captain speaking, but it never came. No voice came, just the radio crackling. I looked ahead at the flight attendant. Surely the speaker was messed up, and she would relay whatever needed to be said. But she didn't. She just stood there, staring at me, smiling. The radio stopped, and I could feel the engines winding up. The cabin lights switched off. I quickly reached up and turned on a small nightlight above my head. I looked away from the front and pulled out my phone to see the time again. It was midnight on the dot. My eyes noticed the no signal symbol at the top right, which wasn't odd entirely because most of the time phones waited until the plane was in the air to lose signal. The plane began to move forward and make its wide turn into the runway. It began to speed up as it reached its peak for takeoff, and finally, sweet relief washed over me as the plane lifted from the ground and was airborne. Nothing else mattered now. It would only be a couple of hours until I was in Atlanta, where I knew from years of travel that it didn't matter what time it was, there would always be people in that airport. The plane reached its maximum altitude, and the fasten seatbelt light went off. I used this time to go to the bathroom. Airplane bathrooms are notoriously small, and this one was no different. I used the bathroom, washed my hands, splashed water over my face, and looked at my reflection. I looked tired, and my face was a bit off color. I reached for the door latch, but as I heard something, a whimper, like a young girl crying. Was someone else on this flight? I opened the door just to see the flight attendant standing directly in front of me. I stepped back cautiously. Her wide grin looked so strange. It was scary. It was unnatural. "Would you care for a beverage?" she asked softly. Her smile was so forced, and the makeup around her eyes was smeared from crying. No thanks," I replied quickly. "Very well," she replied, stepping aside to let me pass. I returned to my seat without looking back at her, but I checked every row and every seat in between, hopelessly praying that someone else was on this flight with me. Once in my seat, I pulled my book from my bag and took a deep breath. I found a bookmark and opened my book to page 283. A coincidence, but still a damn creepy one. I shook off the weird feeling and began to read. Some time went by. I let myself get enveloped by my book. I was so glad to be distracted after a while. I checked my phone again. It was midnight. That was impossible unless it just hadn't updated. Maybe because it had lost service. Yeah, that had to be it. I slid up the window guard and peered at the ground below, as if I could recognize the flight path to Atlanta. It was just darkness, not even lights from the cities underneath. Perhaps we were just over thick clouds. I slid the guard down. I didn't need anything else to worry about. I looked up towards the front of the plane. She just stood there. That flight attendant. I swear to God, her smile never even twitched. It was like it was a mask or something. I don't think she even blinked. Now that I think about it, I definitely had not seen her blink. I put the book back into my bag and set my face in my hands. It had been long enough. When would this plane ride end? My leg began to bounce nervously, as if I was sensing my discomfort. She began to walk towards me, which I can't fully explain why, but I did not want her near me. I felt trapped inside this flying cage, trapped with this ever-smiling flight attendant. She was only a few seats away from me. Now when I blurted out, just wondering how much longer, she stopped coming towards me and turned around without replying. She walked back to the front of the plane, where she faced the door to the cockpit. She then lifted her right hand as if to knock, but instead she only placed her open hand gently on the door. She didn't speak. She just faced the wall. The radio overhead crackled again. Long drawn out static. The seatbelt light activated, and I buckled mine quickly. The radio still crackled. I felt like the plane dipped a little. We were finally descending. The radio stopped. I gripped my arms of my chair. My leg still bouncing. I watched her. She just faced the door, as if she still just faced the door. She was so close to her nose, must have been touching. The plane flew lower and lower until I felt it level out. We would be touching down soon. Almost instantly after thinking about that, the wheels made contact and sent vibrations throughout the plane. I took a deep breath of air, thankful, so thankful that the flight was over. When the plane came to a stop, I unbuckled and stood up quickly, knocking my head against the low ceiling. I cursed and stepped into the aisle. There was nobody to wait for. I didn't care that I was one of those people I had laughed at earlier. I wanted off this plane and away from this flight attendant. The radio overhead crackled again. No words, just crackling. After about 2 minutes, it stopped. I looked ahead at her. She hadn't moved yet. She still faced the door with her back to me. I knew that this part of the flight usually took a few minutes, as the jet bridge had to line up with the hatch before the passengers could step off. I waited nervously until I heard a loud clunk of what I assumed was the bridge connecting to the plane. I stepped forward so that I was only a few seats from the door from her. Finally, she turned, pulled the lever, and unlocked the hatch. The door opened, and she stepped back and faced me. "Chicago O'Hare International Airport," she said with a smile. My stomach dropped. I felt my face go pale for a moment. I just stared back at her. "Chicago? No. No. We left Chicago. We should be in Atlanta, Georgia by now," I thought to myself. I didn't have time or the courage to ask her for an explanation. She didn't move far from the door. I would have to get really close to her to get out. I didn't care at this point. I started walking and tried my hardest to slide past her without touching her by accident. As I was right beside her, I turned, stepped sideways through the door, and heard it. A soft, almost soundless whimper, like a cry. I stopped fully through the doorway and onto the jet bridge before looking back at her. She stood inside the plane, staring at me with her wide smile. Her hands held on each other in front of her, and looked on her face made my blood turn cold. That wide, forced smile and her unblinking eyes, with fresh tears crawling slowly down her cheek. I couldn't help but imagine right then that maybe I hadn't been the only one stuck on this flight. I allowed myself to think for just a second. I had no way of knowing how many times she had made this exact same flight. "Have a nice rest of your trip. We look forward to having you with us again soon," she said, never breaking that smile. I turned and speed walked out of the jet bridge. Thankfully, this one was the normal length. I stepped out of the hall into a crowded terminal, allowing the jet bridge closed behind me. I looked up at the sign hanging above me. "Terminal C of O'Hare Airport." A crowd of people stood in line across the way. Others walked past, some alone, some in groups. I looked up at the screen, displaying the flight that was boarding in front of me. Flight 382 to Atlanta. Departure time, midnight.